I think this is about 10 years or so ago now. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine whose name is Bob. He's the CEO of a printing company. And Bob is a very big fellow. He stands about this tall, he's very round around the chest. He's like a bear. So you definitely want to stay on Bob's good side. But he's also really friendly and he loves to talk. And he was telling me about some research that he'd recently read on employee engagement. And after we chatted a little bit, Bob asked me, Matt, what time of day do you think that most people book their vacations? Now, I had some contextual clues here. I kind of figured I knew where he was going with this. And I said, well, Bob, I would guess that most people book their vacations while they're on their lunch breaks because they're thinking about getting away from work. And Bob said, well, you're close, but it's a little worse than that. Actually, most vacations are booked while people are on the clock on company time. And I said, man, I can't believe people would do that. And Bob said, that's nothing. Apparently, people do very little work while they're at work. So Bob asked me, how many hours a day would you guess that the average person actually works during an 8-hour workday? Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry.
Now, just before I chime in here, what are your thoughts? And I know we might have a couple people from overseas, so if you think that we Americans are lazy, I'll take no offense. But just throw out some numbers here. What do you think, the average American, how many hours a day are we working in an 8-hour day? What would you think? 6, all right, a good optimist. 4, it's going down. Usually there's a couple 2s out there. Well, that's actually what Bob said. He said it was 2. Now, please don't go around quoting that as some verified statistic. I may have remembered this number wrong. Bob may have not had those numbers correct in the first place. But I just remember at the time, it struck me, whether it was 2 or 3, it was very, very low. And I wanted to know, what are people doing with the other 6 hours of the day? And as it turns out, sleeping is a pretty popular activity, sometimes facing up like this, sometimes facing down on our desk and drooling. Also very popular is making funny images with Photoshop, kind of like this one here, or this one. Now, this is actually me wasting time on Photoshop, which is why it's probably not as funny as the first image. That's my son. I think that was his first bath. It didn't go well. But now, for those of you who think that we're torturing the little lad, this is him just a couple months later, loving bathing, eating soap bubbles. Now, so the point of all this is not that I have a cute son. It's that as leaders, we can create and sustain cultures in our workplaces that attract and retain very, very talented people and ensure that those people are fully engaged while they're on our team and not messing around with Photoshop. So what I'd like to do with the short time that we have together here this afternoon in beautiful Chicago is share a few ideas based on my experience and some of the best workplaces in the world that can help us to create and sustain that type of culture that not only attracts and retains talented people, ensures that they're engaged, but is also really the essence of delivering high levels of customer service and boosting innovation. Now, all the ideas that I want to share are based on just one simple shift in our approach to how we interact with people, and most specifically, how we lead. And I did not discover the power of this shift as the result of some great success that I had somewhere. I actually discovered the power of this shift as the result of the greatest failure of my life. So I'd like to start with that. This was about 20 years ago almost now at this point. I was just out of college, a couple years out of college. And for some reason, I convinced myself that I should take a shortcut to success. And I partially attempted a fraud against the United States government. And as a result of being both stupid and doing several dishonest things, I ended up spending 5.5 years confined to prison. And the first year of it was in what essentially amounted to solitary confinement. I spent approximately 22 hours per day alone in a cell that looked almost exactly like that. 6 foot by 9 foot, about the size of probably most of your closets in your bedrooms, and maybe smaller, actually. Now, as you would imagine, this was by far the worst experience of my life at that point. I went through every negative emotion that you could possibly imagine. It was mostly anger directed at myself. I was extremely angry at myself for being so stupid. At that point, I thought I had thrown my whole life away, and I caused tremendous suffering for the people around me, specifically my family. And it was a good week or so, almost 2 weeks, where I was so depressed about the situation that I had suicidal thoughts just flashing through my mind. And it was one particular day, it was very intense, where I almost tried to hurt myself. I never actually did, but got very close. And as terrible as it was, over some time I started to adjust. And this situation actually ended up becoming the best thing that ever happened to me. And again, I would say by far. So very fortunately for me, about a year into my time of being confined, I started learning about this very simple practice called mindfulness training, which is just a pretty straightforward and simple way of training the mind to be more self-aware and to eventually become very free from our thinking. And after about 6 months of engaging in this practice pretty diligently, I'm kind of type A. When I do something, I go all at it. And after about 6 months, I noticed that I was actually happier right there in a prison with nothing than I'd ever been in my entire life. And I had been learning about this practice from books that were written by monastics, and everything that these monks had written about and I had verified through my own experience up to that point, it gave me a lot of faith that this practice is worth something. So I decided to just go as deep as I could. I ended up spending the last 3.5 years of my time in confinement living and training exactly as monks live and train. So I was spending hours and hours every day training my mind formally. And then after leaving confinement, I went to go live in a real monastery. And actually, after being there for about 6 weeks, I told the monks, I want to do this. I want to be a monk for the rest of my life. And so I almost ordained with the shaved head and everything forever. But I realized that I thought I would actually be more able to serve the people around me if I was out here with you all and not in a monastery someplace. And so those were the two big shifts that occurred as a result of this experience. So one, as I mentioned, was I learned that we don't actually need anything external to ourselves to be happy. That is something that can be trained just by working with our own minds. But perhaps more importantly was that I learned that, and many of you probably know this, and we'll come back to this later, but a life that's really worth living, a life that's really fulfilling, is one that's devoted to being of service to the people around us, to being helpful, to taking care of others. And that's what the monastic ideal is entirely about. It's about giving up our short-term self-interest so that we can be of greater service to others. So with this aspiration to serve, as many people who have this aspiration born within them, the first thing that I did was get involved in the nonprofit world and co-founded and led a couple small nonprofits. The second one that I founded was the Florida chapter of an organization that's now international called Kids Kicking Cancer. So although I was the founder and ran that chapter, for the first year I also taught almost all the classes. So it was a pretty busy time. But it was an incredibly rewarding time. I got to work with amazing young heroes like these guys who had just the most devastating diagnoses you can get, like cancer or sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. And what we were teaching these young heroes is that they can actually lower their own pain levels. Just by tapping into their own inner power. So we're teaching mindfulness and other growth tools through the martial arts. And just by tapping into their own inner power, using what we call the secrets of the martial arts, they can lower their own pain levels. Now, everything that we're teaching is backed with plenty of research to demonstrate its effectiveness. And in fact, we had young people who could, in a matter of minutes, they could lower their pain levels from a 9 out of 10 on a pain scale down to a 2 or a 3 out of 10. And we didn't even have to be in the room with them. They could do this completely on their own. So in many cases, what they're doing is more effective than morphine. I may have misspoke. I think I said that we were teaching them things. Have any of you worked with a population like this of very sick young people? I don't see anyone with one person, yes. And those of you who haven't, I'm sure you could intuit this. Most of the time, I wasn't teaching them. They were teaching me. This is the most inspiring and wisest, I dare say, group of human beings I've ever had the privilege of working with. Well, while on this, I guess we could say it's an uncommon journey. I don't think it's totally unique. I would say that without any doubt, the biggest takeaway for me has been that the more focused I've become on what I can do to be of service to others, the happier I've become for one, and the more success I've had by just about every metric that you can measure success by. And after some time, I was reflecting on this, and I was thinking about how team members seem to be more engaged the more that I took care of them. And this question started coming up over and over again. I wonder what would happen if for-profit companies ran like this. What if, as the core operating or the core leadership philosophy of a for-profit business was based around this idea of, hey, let's put taking care of our team members and serving them as a place that is a higher priority than we do some numbers on a spreadsheet, like expenses or quarterly profits. And I think intuitively, we all get this, right? If we really take care of team members, what happens? These people come in, they're much more engaged. That results in better customer service, better product development, it's better cultures for innovation, ultimately in a better bottom line. But I don't like to just rest on intuition. So I started diving in and doing a bunch of research on this topic. And I found company after company after company that demonstrates that over the long term, if we do in fact prioritize serving and taking care of our team members, prioritizing their long-term well-being over our short-term quarterly profits, the balance sheet looks and the profit and the P&L looks very, very good over the long term. So after doing this for speaking on this topic for about 5 years, going out and trying to inspire leaders of organizations to not only connect the dots and realize that, wow, if I come to work with the primary motivation of serving and caring for my team members, it's really good for business outcomes, but also it makes work more fun. It makes it very enjoyable to get up and go to work in the morning. And so for the last 5 years, that's principally what I've done, is go around and speak at different events and try to inspire leaders to make these connections and also provide practical tools for doing this at a very high level. But I have something that some of you might be able to relate to if you've have just this itch to build things. It's called founderitis in the startup world. But I just love to build things and get people smarter than me to run it and then go build something else. And so after speaking on this, I really wanted to do it myself. So in the fall of last year, I started a company called The Generous Group. We're a marketing agency, and of course, just like any other company, we really prioritize delivering a great ROI for our customers. But that's not why we exist. The main reason that we exist is to create a workplace culture where people are thriving. I would dare say that over half of the workplaces in our country, in the United States, are actually making people sick. They're toxic enough, people are anxious enough. Anxiety and stress is the #1 by proxy cause of death in the United States. So our workplaces are literally killing people. And at a baseline motivation, I said, well, let's see how we can create workplaces where people, their well-being is not adversely affected. Maybe even a step above that, where it's a neutral effect, where it's neither adverse or positive. But let's see if we can go even further than that. Let's see if we can build a workplace culture where people's well-being, their physical well-being, their emotional well-being, perhaps even spiritual well-being, just how we develop as human beings, are all actually enhanced as a result of coming to work. So our #1 aspiration is to build a culture like that, to build a culture that is perhaps the best place to work in the world. And the core reason we want to do that is not because I know that it's very good for business, but because I just imagine for a second the effects on society if every company was run like that. If when everyone went to work on a Monday, they were looking forward to it, right? And when they came home, they were refreshed, they were happy, they treated their husbands better or their wives better, their children better, their neighbors better. I actually think that we as business leaders can take very, very significant steps toward creating a culture of world peace by how we manage our workplace cultures. Now, we're very new, so one of the motivations other than contributing to world peace is to create, hopefully, the best case study out there of just how good this is for business so that we can inspire other leaders to do the same. Now, because we're less than a year old, I don't have any data that I would even dare share with you at this point. There's nothing conclusive. So what I'd like to do is share with you some of the case studies that inspired me to do this in the first place. Perhaps the most well-known case study, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, Southwest Airlines. So are any of you Southwest fans by chance, besides me? Oh, almost everyone. Great. Well, as I'm sure many of you are aware, one of the most interesting things that Southwest did, they were not the first company to do this, but they were among the first, to state boldly to the public that their shareholders are not their top priority. And for those of us who all just raised our hands, we're not even their top priority. Those people are the top priority for the leaders at Southwest. Their leaders truly love the employees, and they work very, very hard to serve them. Most of the best examples of this come from the former CEO and chairman, whose name is Herb Kelleher. And there are just story after story I could tell you about him, so I'll keep it to just a few. But Herb was known for consistently doing things like, for one, he would never pass up a team member, almost never, without giving that person a hug. If it was a female team member, oftentimes it was a kiss, sometimes actually on the mouth. As a side note, I highly recommend you don't do any of that. Your HR department will not like you. It's not appropriate. But I've actually spoken to probably 5 or 6 flight attendants in Southwest who were around during the Herb Kelleher days, and I asked them, who actually got a kiss from Herb, and I asked them, what did you think of that? Did it bother you? None of them said that it bothered them. They said, it wasn't like some dirty old man trying to, Mac on a young flight attendant. It was more like a father figure who just loved you so much that he couldn't pass you by without giving you a hug or a kiss. But now Herb was also doing things, and I use the word old man loosely. He was fairly old towards the end of his career, but he also smoked like a chimney, drank. He was pretty frail. And despite these things, he was known also for consistently doing things like coming in on Thanksgiving Day to work side by side with frontline people like baggage handlers, throwing 50-pound suitcases onto airplanes for a few hours. This is a guy running a company of 30,000 plus employees. Herb believed that the best way to lead any team is to lead with love. The best way to lead any organization is to lead with love. Southwest calls themselves the airline that love built, and I don't think they're talking about Love Field. That's just a nice coincidence. You can even see the heart in their logo. For all of those of us who raised our hands as being fans, you probably noticed on their airplanes the new logo is nothing but a heart. Now, from a business standpoint, just maybe by head nods or something, do you all think that they've been successful with this kind of fuzzy formula of leading with love? Yes. In fact, I think I could make a pretty good argument that relative to their industry, they're the most successful company in US history. Up until about 5 or 6 years or so ago, the airline industry was so cutthroat that most airlines were very, very happy if they could have one profitable year every 3 or 4 years. Southwest has been profitable every single year since 1969 or 70, right after their first year of operation. They typically have costs that are half of the industry average. And during much of Herb Kelleher's time, when they were in their peak, their heyday, the market cap of Southwest was typically around 2 to 3 times the rest of their major competitors combined. So I think we can go ahead and chalk that up as at least one victory, right, for this demonstration of how effective we can be as an organization when we put taking care of our team members as our top priority. I'd like to share one other case study for you or with you. This one's pretty well known, but this case study I almost can guarantee none of you have ever heard of unless you've already read Serve to Be Great somehow today since you got the book. But it's a company called NextJump. They're based in New York. I get so excited talking about these guys, I'm going to have to hydrate a little bit first. Feel free to join me if you like. Mine's non-alcoholic, but I won't judge you if you're an early starter. So this is a picture of Charlie Kim, who's the co-founder and current co-CEO. And at NextJump, one of the things that really drives their culture is they're always looking for ways to make the lives of the people that work for them better, both in the workplace and at home. And they're continuously asking in a formal way, what can we do to help you be happier? But even more than that, or even more than that, I should say, is they are building an entire culture. At this point, they probably have a little bit over 400 employees worldwide. They're building an entire culture from the top leadership down to the most frontline person of people who are all more focused on serving and taking care of the people around them than they are on their own short-term self-interest. And perhaps the best evidence of how important this is to the leadership at NextJump is an award they have called the Avenger Award. It's appropriately named. I think that a lot of their team members are just like superheroes. But this award is a $30,000 package. It includes a 3rd week of paid vacation on a beautiful island in the Caribbean. And this award does not go to the top marketing person, doesn't go to the top salesperson, doesn't go to the top programmer. They're a tech company. This award has absolutely nothing to do with revenue. The award goes to the #1 peer-voted most selfless, helpful person in the company. It goes to the best servant leader, so to speak. And I was at the Avenger Award ceremony a few years ago in New York. I got to see this young man named Gauri be announced as the winner. He kind of looks like he should win, doesn't he? This is one of the nicest people I've ever met. And when he was announced as the winner, there was a room full of about 250, 300 people, most of them his peers. And you might expect when somebody's announced as the winner of a $30,000 package that there might be a little bit of jealousy or maybe even some animosity, like, oh, he shouldn't have got it, she should have, or something like that. That did not happen. I turned around, I noticed that he was receiving a standing ovation, and I looked at the eyes of the people in the room. Almost everyone had tears in their eyes because it was so inspiring to see a human being at a for-profit company being honored in this way for simply serving the people around them. And the audience included his parents, who were flown in from India to see him receive the honor. Mom looks pretty proud there, doesn't she? That is one proud mama. Now, what do you suppose happens when you build a culture like this? You know, perhaps most obvious is you get teams that work a whole lot better as teams, right? You get people talking, the language is we, right? How are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to reach this lofty goal? Not me, not I. But perhaps more subtle is you tend to get the best people in your industry. In NextJump's case, perhaps the best people in the world working at your organization. They're fully engaged while they're with you, and they don't want to leave. So here are a couple of very specific examples for you, business examples. In 2012, NextJump had almost 18,000 people apply for 35 open positions. That is a hire rate of 0.2%. To put that in perspective, the admission rate to Harvard that year was 6. So it was 30 times easier to get into Harvard than it was to get a job at NextJump. Now, what makes this a little bit more remarkable is, raise your hand if you've ever even heard of NextJump. Nobody. This is not Google we're talking about, right? Google, I think, has, what, a 1% hire rate, something like that? But you can't look on the internet without seeing Google, and you know you have the bring your dog to work and the foosball tables. Google's great. Everybody knows that. None of you have ever heard of NextJump. I spoke in New York City in June for a group of people that were 3 blocks away from their headquarters. None of them had heard of NextJump. How does a company that nobody has ever heard of get 18,000 applications for 35 open positions? That's what a culture like this can do. The people there are so engaged that just a couple years prior to that, before I met Charlie, they had a couple team members ask if they could have some bedrooms put in the New York City office. And because they said, you know, oftentimes we're so passionate about what we're working on and who we're working with, and we want to stay late. And Charlie and other leaders said, no way. People are going to sue us for running a sweatshop or something, right, if we have bedrooms in the office? But the employees made a very good argument. They said, look, we want to stay late often, but in New York, much like probably in Chicago, people who commute on the L, you know, if you want to stay late there, then what that means is you take an hour back and forth on the subway, you lose 2 hours of sleep. And if they had a bed in the office, what that meant is you could eliminate that commute. They had a gym there in the office. They always had, much like Google and the other tech companies, they always had the free healthy food out that you can eat. They said, what's the problem? And so management acquiesced. And there are now actually 2 bedrooms in the New York City office. Can you imagine a for-profit company where team members are voluntarily asking to have sleepovers in the office? It's actually happening. And their ability to retain those team members is also pretty remarkable. So in the tech space, every year, voluntary turnover averages around 20%. The year I researched it for Serve to be Great, I think it was 22. So roughly 1 in 5 people, talented people, are leaving voluntarily every year. Is any of you aware of what that costs you in very precise terms? I know we all know that's not good, right? Most HR professionals estimate that for a mid-level employee that you would like to have on your team, that losing that person costs you a year's salary. If you start getting up into higher management, it can be 2 to 3 times annual salary. So now, it doesn't take a mathematician to realize if your turnover is 20%, or in some industries 30 and 40%, that is a huge hit on productivity and specifically on the bottom line. So you might think, okay, NextJump has this great culture, and the industry average is 20% turnover. Maybe theirs is only 15, or maybe it's even 10. In most years, their turnover is around 1%. And that is despite the fact that their employees are oftentimes getting calls from other companies in the tech space trying to get them out of NextJump to come work for them, because it's a very, very competitive. Programmers are really hard to come by. They're offering them sometimes 2 to 3 times their annual salary. And most of the times, the employees don't even return the phone calls. They're totally happy where they are. And one last benefit I'd like to share, I mean, there are many others, but just to keep this short and to try to make it as hyper-focused, I think, on what's relevant to the procurement industry. So I know innovation is a huge topic right now. This, I think, is one of the most, if not the most, important factors of creating a culture of innovation in a team. Because the 2 biggest blocks to innovation other than not having the right people on your team, are bureaucracy, red tape, and fear. And if we're a leader who truly cares about our team members and we really want to serve them, what's one of the first things we would want to get rid of? Red tape, right? Red tape is just, these are essentially just roadblocks to people getting things done, right? So we become allergic to it. The second thing, fear, you cannot innovate in a workplace where fear exists. Why? Because innovation almost never happens in a vacuum. There are some unicorn examples like Apple. I mean, Steve Jobs just sat around and thought stuff up and said 20 years from now, everyone's going to buy this, and he was right. That happens sometimes, but almost never. In almost every case, innovation is a result of doing something, getting real-world feedback from customers, whether internal or external, failing, iterating, trying again, and oftentimes with multiple pivots with each iteration. Oftentimes, innovations end up being solving a completely different problem that you started off trying to solve. Does anyone use Slack? Has anyone ever heard of Slack? The people who created Slack did not want to create Slack. They had a whole other startup they were working on. They created Slack for themselves internally. It was awesome. They shared it with some people. Now they're Slack. That's not how they started off. But they never would have got to Slack if they didn't start doing something and risk failure. And people on a team are never going to take the chance to risk failure, to express an idea that challenges the status quo, which is the first step, and then have time and the ambition to work on it without fear of being reprimanded if it fails. Because you're going to fail. By definition, you should actually have failure as a goal if you want to innovate. How many times can you fail and how quickly? Because the more quickly you get to failure, the sooner you're going to get to the solution that results in value for the end consumer. Right? So a culture where fear is removed, innovation can just flourish. And this, I don't think it's any coincidence if you look at companies like Google, SaaS, these companies that are often acclaimed as being the most innovative in the world, guess where they almost always end up on Forbes' list of the best places to work? They're towards the top, right? This is not coincidence, I don't think. Now, I've tried to make this very brief and very focused on business. And we can certainly address any questions that you have regarding culture in organizations and business. And I also think that this is really what life comes down to, right? This is not just about business. This is really what life comes down to. And I think everyone in this room, somewhere inside, we all know this. In fact, there's some interesting research I read this is probably coming on 15 years now or so ago. It was on near-death experiences. And I think it's not the best research in the world, but I think it's very interesting how it points to how well we all know this somewhere. So those of you not heard of near-death experiences, this is where somebody is pronounced as clinically dead by a medical professional. I mean, they're brain dead. And then that might last for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. In some cases, it's 15 minutes or longer. And then they're later revived, and they can come back and talk about what it was like to be dead. Now, the research that I read included case studies from all over the world. So, I mean, there's hundreds of them. I think it was 300 plus case studies. So as you would expect, many of these experiences are reported slightly differently. But there was one aspect of the experience that was almost the same, almost identical in just about every single case. It turns out that as these people were approaching the boundary between this world and whatever might lie beyond it, they were all asked a question. Now, where it got very interesting to me is that it didn't matter what country these people came from. It didn't matter what language they spoke. It didn't matter how old they were. It didn't matter what their ethnic group was. It didn't matter what their gender identity was. In fact, it didn't even matter what religious background they had. If they were a Christian, it was Jesus asking them this question. If they were Muslim, it was Allah. If they were an agnostic or an atheist, it was their own deepest inner self asking them this question. But in almost every case, when these people approached the boundary between this world and the next, the question was the same. How well did you love? How well did you love? Now, this love that we're talking about, this is not a feeling. Okay, we don't have to like a person to love a person. Love is an action, it's a verb. When we love a person, we treat that person with respect, with kindness, and we extend ourselves to help that person meet the legitimate needs that she or he has in their lives. That is love. And to me, that is the absolute essence of being the most effective leader that we can be. So I would like to close by humbly asking a favor of you. And that is you consider making it either your top priority or in your top 3 at a minimum every day to commit to loving well and doing at least one thing to systematically train yourself to love better. There is absolutely no doubt that this will help you to be more effective as a leader, more effective in terms of achieving the business outcomes that you want to achieve. And this may just be the single most important thing that we do in our entire lives. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Do we have a few minutes for questions?
Absolutely.
Chris? And Chris?
Yeah, we have
Squared.
time.
Yes. What is your name?
Betsy.
Hi, Betsy.
Hi.
Nice to virtually meet you, it seems like, from this distance. It's almost like social media, right, Elizabeth, from this far away?
You talk about it last bedrooms and the luxury people and all of that. And I guess my impression of that always has been what better way to keep people at work and not doing anything other than their lives than to give them free dry cleaning and let them visit the dentist at the office. And so I'm just curious, do you think people look at that as what a great place to work because look at what they do for us, or do they look at it as all I ever do is work because I never have to leave the office because everything is provided for me?
Both. In fact, Elizabeth, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have several friends at Google, and that's actually a problem that they ran into and that they're actively working to solve, is that yes, you can have a great workplace culture, but if people are around too much, they're eventually going to burn out. You need to have balance. So I think it's absolutely critical to realize that, and also to realize that each person is different. So I'll give you an example of something we're doing at the Generous Group. So one of the things that is kind of our core is we pay a competitive 40-hour-a-week salary, but we encourage people to work no more than 32 hours per week. But they can do that if they want. What's most important is we look at each person individually, and we say, like, for instance, a team member is a mom, and she loves to be around her kids. And so she works from home, and she can come into the office if she wants to, but she doesn't have to. So it's more of what do you need to thrive, and each person, and to the greatest extent possible without sacrificing the effectiveness of the team, to help them do that, right? So for some people, for somebody right out of college who's 21, like I was a maniac, and I could easily work 80 hours a week and be just fine. I burned it off with running and surfing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was no problem. But for a parent of 2 small children, that is disaster just waiting to happen, right? So there's no magic answer here, I think, in terms of how much people work or how long they should stay at work. But it is something, I'm really glad you brought that up, that we should always be mindful of. And so this is like to kind of put this as to just one simple takeaway, if you could take anything away from this talk, is to always be thinking about the long-term well-being of each individual member of your team. Because to come back to your example, if we have a keg in the office, of course people love coming to work, but they're not going to get that much done. And is drinking every day at lunchtime really that good for your brain or your health? No. So that can just be I think that's the best filter, is what is going to take care of the long-term physical and emotional well-being, and in terms of how somebody's growing even, personally and professionally, of each team member. And that's going to be a little bit different for each person. But that, I think, is the best filter, because you cannot go wrong. It's just like with a parent. For any of us who had parents, like that mother with her son, who just focused so much on loving his mother, like any of us who had experienced that type of love, we would do anything for our parents, which is probably why he did, right? So as leaders, there's this little thing, we've all heard the term discretionary effort, right? And when we truly love team members, that we tap into that. You don't have to ask for people to give the extra effort when it's needed, they just give it. But I think the best filter for what does that actually mean, loving a team member, it's kind of like what we think of with our kids. Every decision we make for our kids is what's the best for their long-term well-being. Not what's going to make them happy right now. Of course, a Snickers bar is going to make Junior happy right now, but that's not good for him, right? So did that answer your question at least to some degree?
No, thank you.
And just one additional thought on that is, since we do have just a couple minutes here, is, I imagine you all agree that was kind of a touchy-feely as you're going to get in a business talk. But I also think loving team members means not accepting mediocrity, right? Because that doesn't serve anybody. Just, again, coming back to our kids. If you let your kid bring home D's every day, they're not going to do well, right? Unless they go start Apple, But they have to do something. They have to do well in school or do well in starting businesses. But something, they have to cultivate a work ethic, right? So as leaders, I think it's absolutely critical that we have team members that are aspiring to excellence and we help facilitate that. Because if I allow, let's say we have a 10-person team and we talk about excellence every day in our team meetings, but then we have one person that's coming in every day who's mediocre. What are we telling the other 9 team members? We're just BSing in our team meetings about excellence. We don't mean it, right? Because we're letting this person come to work every day and be mediocre. And we're not serving the person who's mediocre. That's not loving that person, because eventually we're going to have to find a different team for that person to play on. And then when she or he goes there, they're probably going to be terrible there and get fired, right? So that's not loving a person. But so there's a fine line between really caring about somebody and helping them aspire to excellence and developing the habits that are going to help them achieve excellence versus demanding it. And when we demand it, that's when we become, kind of an authoritative, not very effective leader who can create a toxic environment. But if we truly love someone, that does not mean that we're not very, very focused, perhaps even more so, on facilitating excellence on our teams. So just wanted to throw that out there, since we did have a couple extra minutes so you think they're, not that this is just pure touchy-feely stuff here. Yes, what is your name?
Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
Hey, I can't stand stories that start and we don't hear the rest of it. You mentioned at the beginning that you were in prison, and rather than making you go through the story of how you ended up there, I'd be interested to know. You also mentioned that when you were young, you would have worked crazy hours and that sort of thing, and that maybe you took some shortcuts. Knowing what you know now, how would you, as a leader, identify in a younger employee where they might be on that track, to maybe make some shortcuts or make some erroneous decisions? Was there something in the culture of the company that you were working for, or were there not the right checks and balances in place, or is there something, from a personality perspective that you could maybe pick up on that would help us if we were looking up?
Sure. I hadn't actually put that much thought into it. So give me just 1 second here. Let me think about it for a moment. Because there are 2 things that immediately come to mind, and I want to make sure that this is helpful. So using my personal example, I was actually in the Marine Corps at the time, and so it was not a culture fit for me. I mean, I love the Marine Corps. I still do. It's the most honorable organization that I know of. And for people who think that the Marine Corps is a bunch of savages who are trained killers, my experience was that the higher you got up in leadership, the more people loved their people, just like we're talking about. In fact, if you go around and you ask a senior leader in the Marine Corps to define Marine Corps leadership, they're going to tell you it's simple. Officers eat last. That's it. You take care of your people, everybody lives. That's how Marine Corps leaders think. However, I'm not a very, so this will make this really obvious. In kindergarten, I almost failed because I would not color inside the lines. And finally, my mom got bad report after bad report after bad report, and they said, have you ever thought about just giving him a piece of paper and a crayon? They tried that, and I drew a perfect tree and colored inside the lines. And so that was maybe an early sign that I do not do very well with bureaucracy and structure. And as much as I love the Marine Corps, you don't get much more bureaucracy and structure than you get in the military. So I think there were some other factors, too, that I don't want to make excuses for what I did. I mean, I take full responsibility for doing wrong. There, of course, were other mitigating factors, and anxiety, I think, was the biggest one. So from my experience, I don't have a lot of experience in helping people do this, like to find where somebody might end up taking a shortcut. But if I were to look at it, like, how would I prevent 24-year-old Matthew from doing this again? It would probably be coming back to that work-life balance, having constructive means for dealing with anxiety. I am wired to be perhaps one of the most anxious people on the planet. I mean, I get anxious over everything. And it's without the last 18 years of mindfulness training or whatever it's been, I would probably be a wreck, But as I'm actually the exact opposite right now. Like I almost don't have anxiety at all thanks to mindfulness training. So I would say, we have to have constructive ways, and there are lots of things. One of them is work environment and having work-life balance. But there are many, many things that we should be looking at to consider the emotional well-being of team members, because I think anxiety is a huge driver. And this is well documented in research, that our decision-making goes down immediately as soon as the fight or flight response is engaged, and it gets worse and worse and worse the more that we move into the amygdala, into the limbic system of the brain. So this is not disputable. We know that if people are anxious, they're making bad decisions, plain and simple. But I also think if somebody's not a culture fit, then that's adding to the anxiety, and it's also people are just thinking, how can I get out of this quickly with causing the least amount of damage? So I think that the best thing there is having a very well thought out interview process for people that you bring on your team. And, I don't think there's any harm. This is not being a double negative there. How can I make this more clear? You can still be a very loving leader and let go of a team member that's not a culture fit. In fact, I would say there's nothing that should cause you to let go of a team member faster than when they don't live the core values of the team. Because that will kill any team very, very fast, especially if the leaders aren't living the core values. That's the worst case scenario. But so, if you're bringing new people on, is to interview those people based on values fit. You should always imagine all of your organizations are big enough that you can't even get an interview unless you're a skills fit, right? They're doing some type of test with HR to be able to show that they have those skills. Your interviews with management should always be about culture fit, because that is just absolutely critical. If you have somebody that's not a culture fit, it's actually the most loving thing you can do to find a different team for them, because they're going to be miserable every day. They might attempt a shortcut or do something unethical. At best, or I guess I should say at worst, at best they're going to come in and not be productive and maybe even drag other team members down. So that was maybe a longer answer, but it's coming back to the two main points. Ensuring culture fit for the core values of the team, I think, is absolutely critical, and then making sure that people have good coping mechanisms to dealing with anxiety. So was that at all helpful? Sure. How are we doing? Time for one more, Chris and Chris, or should we wrap up? If there is one more.
Are there any more questions?
You all ready for some drinks, huh? Okay, great. Thanks for hanging out. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Matt.
Bye, Mike.
Appreciate it.